the Grandfather Paradox. Picture a situation where traveling through time is real and you own a machine that can move you through different eras. You choose to journey into the past so you can meet your grandfather when he was still a young adult. At first, everything feels exciting, but the situation suddenly becomes serious. While you are visiting the past, you accidentally stop your grandfather from ever meeting your grandmother. Because of this mistake, your parents are never born, and if your parents never exist, then you also would never come into existence. Now, the strange part appears. If you were never born, then how could you possibly travel back through time and stop your grandfather from meeting your grandmother? If you never existed at all, you could not have returned to the past to cause this problem in the first place. This situation creates a logical conflict because your behavior in the past seems to remove the very reason for your own existence. This strange problem is called the Grandfather Paradox. It is a well-known issue that appears in conversations about time travel and cause and effect. The paradox pushes us to question how cause and effect really work, and it also makes us wonder whether time can stay consistent if the past can be changed. To imagine the paradox more clearly, think about it this way. If you could travel into the past and change events so that you were never born, then you create a situation where you should never have been able to make those changes. This creates a contradiction where the cause, which is your trip through time, disagrees with the effect, which is your own existence. The Grandfather Paradox is not only an idea used for thought experiments, it also has important meaning for how we think about time travel. If time travel like this truly existed, it might create confusing conflicts and complicated problems about causality and the direction of time. The Grandfather Paradox leads to many fascinating questions about the true nature of time and reality itself. If traveling to the past could create problems like this paradox, then what does that say about whether going back through time is actually possible? One common way people answer this paradox involves the idea of parallel universes or alternate timelines. According to this idea, if you traveled into the past and changed something, you would actually create a completely new timeline where those changes happen. In this new timeline, your choices might stop your own birth inside that timeline, but your actions would not change the original timeline where you first began your journey. In this explanation, the Grandfather Paradox disappears because time travel creates new branching timelines instead of changing one single fixed timeline. Every timeline stays logical within its own reality, which avoids contradictions by separating the changes into different versions of reality. Another idea used to explain the paradox is called time loops, or closed time-like curves. This concept suggests that events in the past already belong to a closed loop, meaning that anything you do when traveling into the past has already been included in the timeline. In simple terms, you might discover that you cannot truly change important events in the past because those events already include your actions as part of the story. In this way of thinking, the paradox is solved because the timeline always stays self-consistent. Your actions, even if they appear to threaten your own existence, are actually pieces of a larger loop of events that cannot be changed and therefore never create contradictions. The Grandfather Paradox also encourages deeper conversations about the limits of our understanding of time and causality. It challenges the simple ideas we normally have about cause and effect and pushes us to rethink how time flows and whether the past could ever be changed. The Grandfather Paradox is not only a philosophical brain teaser, it also has meaning for many areas of study, including physics, philosophy, and even storytelling in popular culture. The paradox encourages people to discuss the nature of time, the meaning of causality, and whether time travel could ever truly exist. In the field of physics, the paradox creates questions about whether the laws of nature can stay consistent if time travel happens. Many scientific theories, including Einstein's theory of relativity, suggest that time travel might be possible in theory, but they also hint at limits that might stop paradoxes like the grandfather paradox from happening. For instance, some scientists believe certain requirements, such as needing endless amounts of energy or special structures in space-time, like closed time-like curves, might prevent paradoxical events from ever occurring. From a philosophical point of view, the paradox also challenges how we understand determinism and free will. If traveling through time were truly possible, it could create debates about whether our choices are already decided or whether we actually have the freedom to change what happens. The paradox forces us to think carefully about the meaning of altering events in the past and what that might mean for how reality works. In popular culture, the grandfather paradox has inspired many stories in books, television, and films that explore the strange results of time travel. These fictional stories often experiment with the paradox in imaginative ways, showing the problems and possible answers that might appear when people try to travel through time. When we think about the future, the grandfather paradox continues to be a useful thought experiment that helps us explore the limits of what we understand about time and reality. Even though time travel is still only a theoretical idea, the paradox gives us clues about the kinds of problems and limits that could appear if such a thing were ever possible. In conclusion, the grandfather paradox is a powerful puzzle that pushes us to rethink our ideas about time, causality, and the structure of reality. By studying this paradox and thinking about its consequences, we can develop a deeper understanding of the complicated issues connected with time travel and the larger philosophical questions that come with it. Liar's Paradox. The liar paradox is a famous and fascinating puzzle found in philosophy and logic that studies the idea of truth and statements that refer to themselves. The paradox appears when a sentence talks about itself in a way that produces a logical conflict. To understand this puzzle clearly, we need to look at its simple form and think about what it means for the way we understand logic. The basic form of the liar paradox can be written with the sentence, "This statement is false." To understand this idea, we must study whether the sentence is true or false. If we suppose that the sentence is true, then it correctly describes itself as false. Yet, if it is really false, then the sentence becomes true because it says that it is false. This situation creates a contradiction because the statement cannot logically be true and false at the same time. This puzzle shows a weakness with self-referring statements in normal binary logic systems, where sentences are usually placed into two groups, true or false. The liar paradox questions this simple two-part system by creating a situation where the truth of a sentence cannot be clearly decided. The liar paradox has connections to very old philosophical ideas. One of the earliest examples comes from the Greek thinker Epimenides, who once stated, "All Cretans are liars." Epimenides himself was from Crete, so his words became a self-referring statement. If what he said is true, then as a Cretan, he must also be lying, which causes a contradiction. On the other hand, if he is lying, then it means not every Cretan is a liar, which would make his statement false. This early example shows how confusing self-referring statements can become. In modern logic, the liar paradox is usually written in a clearer form. "This statement is false." This version directly shows the core idea of the paradox and makes it an easy example of how self-reference can create logical conflicts. The paradox questions our ability to place statements into simple truth categories and reveals deeper problems within the basic structure of logic. The simple form of the liar paradox can also be expanded into many different versions of paradoxical sentences. For example, imagine the sentence, "This statement is neither true nor false." This version suggests that a sentence may not belong to the usual two groups of truth and falsehood, which raises the question of whether new logical categories or systems might be required to explain such situations. Another version involves several self-referring statements connected together. For instance, imagine a group of sentences where each one comments on whether the others are true or false. This can create complicated networks of self-reference that make the paradox even more confusing. These examples demonstrate that the paradox is not limited to a single form, but can be reshaped to explore many sides of self-reference and logical consistency. The liar paradox carries deep importance for the study of logic and formal systems. It shows weaknesses in traditional logical structures that depend on simple, true, or false values. By presenting a case where the truth of a sentence cannot be clearly decided, the paradox challenges the ability of existing systems of logic to manage self-referring and contradictory statements. The paradox also opens the door for the development of more advanced logical theories created to deal with these issues. To understand the liar paradox fully, we must think about how formal systems can be designed so they avoid contradictions while still allowing self-referring statements to exist in a clear and organized way. To understand the liar paradox more carefully, we must study both its logical meaning and its philosophical impact. This paradox is not only a curious puzzle, it acts as a serious challenge to the foundations of logic and the concept of self-reference. By exploring these ideas, we can better recognize the complexity involved and the wider influence it has on structured reasoning. The liar paradox reveals important problems inside classical logical systems, especially when dealing with self-reference and the meaning of truth. In classical logic, sentences are normally sorted into two categories, true or false. However, the liar paradox produces a case where this simple classification no longer works. The statement, "This statement is false," cannot be placed clearly into either group without producing a contradiction. The paradox challenges the belief that every statement must possess a definite truth value. When a statement talks about itself and forms a logical loop, ordinary binary logic cannot provide a consistent answer. This suggests that classical logical systems have limits and might not be fully prepared to handle every kind of self-referring statement. The consequences of the liar paradox also reach into formal systems used in mathematics and logic. Formal systems are built to create a strict structure for reasoning and to avoid contradictions. However, the liar paradox reveals weaknesses in these systems, especially when they involve self-reference. One possible way to deal with this issue is to redesign formal systems so that self-referring sentences cannot cause contradictions. For example, type theory, developed by Bertrand Russell and other thinkers, introduces a system of levels to prevent self-reference. In this framework, sets are arranged in layers, and a set cannot include itself or other sets that belong to the same or higher layer. This layered structure helps avoid paradoxes by stopping the creation of self-referring statements. From a philosophical viewpoint, the liar paradox also raises important questions about the nature of truth and meaning. It questions the belief that statements can always be labeled as true or false, and encourages us to explore more detailed ways of understanding truth. The paradox suggests that our traditional ideas about truth might have limits, and that new systems may be needed to deal with self-referring sentences. The paradox also shows how complex language and meaning can become. When a sentence refers to itself, it may produce logical loops that challenge our normal understanding. This has consequences for the way we study meaning and interpretation in language, showing that self-reference can create difficult situations that require careful thinking. In response to the problems raised by the liar paradox, several new approaches have been suggested. One such method is semantic theory, which studies how meaning and truth can be explained when self-reference exists. Semantic theories try to create systems where statements about truth can be defined and interpreted in a consistent way. Another idea is dialetheism, a view that allows some statements to be both true and false at the same time. This perspective challenges the traditional two-value view of truth and offers a method for handling self-referring paradoxes by accepting that certain statements may hold more than one truth value. Dialetheism offers a way to manage paradoxes like the liar paradox without falling into contradictions. The liar paradox has shaped both logic and philosophy by revealing the limits of classical thinking and encouraging the development of new theories. It has inspired deeper study into the ideas of truth, self-reference, and formal reasoning. The paradox acts as a starting point for exploring more advanced logical structures and philosophical viewpoints. By studying the liar paradox and its consequences, we gain a better understanding of the difficulty involved in defining truth when self-reference is present. The paradox reminds us how complicated logical systems can be and why careful thinking is required when dealing with self-referring statements. The liar paradox not only questions our ideas about logic and truth, but also influences several fields outside philosophy and formal logic. Its influence spreads into areas such as computer science, mathematics, and linguistics, shaping both theory and practical work. In computer science, the liar paradox highlights the need to manage self-reference and recursion in programming and algorithm design. Self-referring structures, such as recursive functions, are commonly used in programming but must be controlled carefully to prevent paradoxical results. For example, a function that repeatedly calls itself without a proper stopping rule can create endless loops or unpredictable behavior, reflecting the same self-reference problems seen in the liar paradox. To manage self-reference in programming, developers use techniques such as base cases in recursion to stop endless repetition and guarantee that functions eventually finish their tasks. These strategies help avoid paradox-like problems that appear when self-reference is not carefully limited. Understanding and controlling recursion is essential for building dependable and efficient algorithms, and lessons from paradoxes like the liar paradox help strengthen this knowledge. The liar paradox has also shaped mathematical logic by emphasizing the need for stronger systems to deal with self-referring statements. One major development connected to this issue is Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which study the limits of formal systems and the role of self-reference. Gödel's theorems show that in any sufficiently complex formal system, there will be statements that cannot be proven either true or false within that system, reflecting the same self-reference issues highlighted by the liar paradox. Gödel's work expands the ideas suggested by the liar paradox and places them into a wider context, demonstrating that no formal system can be both completely consistent and entirely complete. This discovery carries deep consequences for the foundations of mathematics and logical reasoning, revealing limits in our ability to fully describe truth and consistency inside formal systems. In linguistics, the liar paradox contributes to the study of self-reference and meaning in language. Self-referring sentences like those seen in the paradox challenge traditional ideas about how meaning is formed and interpreted. The paradox encourages linguists to study how self-reference influences the semantics of language and how statements about truth and falsehood can be meaningfully understood. Semantic theory, mentioned earlier, offers one method for understanding how meaning and truth may be handled when self-reference exists. This field studies different methods for dealing with paradoxes and self-referring statements, providing insights into how language can manage complicated logical ideas. The study of self-reference in language also deepens our understanding of how meaning is created and interpreted in different situations. The liar paradox also holds cultural and theoretical importance. It has inspired many works of literature, art, and media that explore ideas of paradox, self-reference, and the nature of truth. The paradox stands as a strong symbol of the complexity and contradictions that appear when humans attempt to understand and define reality. In popular culture, references to the liar paradox and related puzzles often appear in discussions about logic, philosophy, and even science fiction. These references demonstrate the lasting fascination with paradoxical reasoning and its importance for understanding truth and the structure of reality. The liar paradox has created a lasting influence across many fields, including computer science, mathematics, linguistics, and cultural theory. Its effect reaches beyond philosophical debate and influences real-world issues in programming, mathematical logic, and language studies. By exploring the paradox and its many uses, we gain valuable knowledge about the challenges of self-reference and the meaning of truth. As scholars continue to study the difficulties introduced by the liar paradox, it remains a powerful example of the limits within traditional logical systems and the continuing need to expand and refine our understanding of logic and meaning. Ship of Theseus. The Ship of Theseus paradox is a famous and deeply interesting puzzle in philosophy that asks difficult questions about identity, change, and how something can stay the same as time passes. The paradox focuses on the idea of gradual replacement. Imagine a ship that, over many years, has every part slowly replaced one piece at a time until none of the original pieces remain. The question then appears, can we still say it is the same ship? This simple-sounding question actually carries powerful meaning for the way we understand objects, identity, and continuity. The paradox takes its name from Theseus, a heroic character from Greek mythology. According to the story, after Theseus returned from many adventures, including his famous battle with the Minotaur, the people of Athens kept his ship as a symbol of his bravery. As time passed, however, the wooden parts of the ship slowly began to rot and break apart. To protect and preserve the ship, the Athenians replaced each plank, mast, and beam with new pieces of wood. Eventually, every single part of the ship had been replaced. The question that follows is whether the ship, after all these replacements, is still the same ship that Theseus once sailed. At first, it might appear obvious that the ship is still the same. After all, it keeps the same shape, the same purpose, and the same function. People still recognize it as the Ship of Theseus, and it continues to represent the memory of Theseus and an important part of Athenian history. However, the fact that none of the original materials remain creates a serious challenge to this belief. If the identity of the ship depends on its physical parts, then how can it still be the same ship when every one of those parts has been replaced? This question introduces the philosophical idea called identity over time, which studies how something can remain the same object even while it changes. One way to think about this problem is through physical continuity, the idea that an object keeps its identity as long as there is some physical connection between its earlier form and its current form. From this viewpoint, the ship slowly loses its identity as its original parts are replaced, and it may become a completely different ship once every part is new. However, this explanation raises additional questions. For example, if identity depends on physical continuity, how many parts must be replaced before the ship stops being the same ship? Is there a clear point where the identity suddenly changes, or does the ship slowly lose its identity little by little as parts are replaced? These questions reveal how difficult it is to define identity using only physical continuity. Another way to understand the paradox focuses on conceptual identity, the idea that the identity of something depends not on its physical materials, but on its concept or role. From this perspective, the Ship of Theseus remains the same ship as long as it continues to serve the same function and people still recognize it as the same object. This view suggests that the identity of the ship is protected not by its materials, but by the continuity of its form, purpose, and meaning within society. This idea matches how we often think about identity in everyday life. For instance, imagine a museum artifact that has been repaired using new materials so it keeps its appearance. Even though the materials have changed, people may still consider the artifact genuine because it represents the same historical object. In the same way, the Ship of Theseus might still keep its identity as long as people continue to understand and value it as the ship connected to Theseus, no matter how many changes it has experienced. However, this raises another important question about what exactly we mean when we say the ship is the same. Are we talking about a physical object, an idea, or something else entirely? And if identity depends on ideas instead of materials, does that mean almost any object could be considered the same as long as it fits the concept? These are some of the deeper questions the Ship of Theseus paradox encourages us to explore. When we continue thinking about identity, the paradox becomes even more complicated with another interesting scenario. Imagine that every plank, mast, and beam removed from the ship was carefully saved instead of thrown away. Over time, someone gathers all the original pieces and rebuilds the ship exactly as it was before. Now we face a confusing situation. There are two ships. One ship is the repaired vessel made entirely from new parts, and the other ship is built completely from the original pieces. Which one should be called the real Ship of Theseus? This situation introduces the idea of reassembly, which makes the problem of identity even more difficult. If the ship's identity depends on its original materials, then the ship rebuilt from the original pieces might seem to be the true Ship of Theseus. After all, it contains the exact parts that once formed the ship Theseus sailed. From this viewpoint, the ship that was slowly repaired with new materials might be seen as only a copy or a completely different vessel, even though it kept the same shape and purpose over time. Yet, the situation is not that simple. If we say that the rebuilt ship is the true Ship of Theseus, then we must explain why the ship that stayed in use and was repaired for years is not the original. That ship was preserved carefully so the memory of Theseus would survive, and it continued to represent history and culture. Can we really say it lost its identity simply because its materials were replaced? The conflict between these ideas shows that identity may not be a simple concept, but something affected by history, intention, and context. The rebuilt ship may contain the original materials, but it does not have the same continuous history that the repaired ship carries. Meanwhile, the repaired ship kept its historical role but lost its connection to the original materials. This leads to the possibility that both ships could, in some sense, be considered the Ship of Theseus. Each ship represents a different kind of identity. One represents physical continuity through materials, while the other represents conceptual or functional continuity through history and purpose. This kind of identity conflict is not unique to the Ship of Theseus. Similar situations appear in many areas of life, especially when preserving cultural heritage. For example, when historians restore ancient buildings or artworks, they often face the challenge of choosing between preserving original materials or replacing damaged parts to keep the structure standing. Should we keep the original materials even if they are falling apart, or should we replace them so the building continues to exist? These questions reflect the same issues raised by the Ship of Theseus paradox and show how difficult it can be to maintain identity over time. Another interesting result of the paradox appears in modern technology and human identity. In a world where medicine can replace organs, tissues, and body parts, we may ask whether a person who has received many medical replacements is still the same individual. If every organ in a person's body were slowly replaced with artificial ones, would they still be the same person? This question is not just theoretical, but connects to deep ethical and philosophical ideas about what it means to be human and how we define personal identity as change occurs. The paradox also invites us to think about memory and consciousness when discussing identity. While the Ship of Theseus is not a living being, the idea can still be compared to personal identity. Just as a ship slowly replaces its parts, people also change over time through physical growth, mental development, and life experiences. This comparison raises the question of whether we remain the same person throughout our lives or whether we slowly become someone different as these changes occur. In this way, the reassembly version of the Ship of Theseus paradox pushes us to think more deeply about identity. It encourages us to move beyond simple physical explanations and consider the roles of meaning, function, memory, and intention when deciding whether something remains the same. As we continue to examine this paradox, it becomes clear that the Ship of Theseus is not only a puzzle about a ship, but also a powerful exploration of what it means to remain the same. Whether we think about objects, people, or societies, the paradox asks us to reconsider how identity survives through change. As we explore the Ship of Theseus paradox further, it becomes clear that its ideas extend far beyond philosophy and connect with real situations in everyday life. One important concept to examine is functional continuity, which explains how something may keep its identity by continuing to perform the same role even when its physical parts change. This perspective helps explain how the paradox relates to many different areas, including law, science, and daily experiences. In legal situations, the idea of functional continuity can help determine the identity of objects or organizations. For example, in property law, the identity of an item may depend on its function or purpose rather than the exact materials used to create it. Imagine a historical artifact that has been repaired many times. From a legal viewpoint, it might still be considered the same object because it continues to serve the same cultural or historical role, even though many of its materials have been replaced. This way of thinking supports the idea that identity depends more on purpose than on physical components. The Ship of Theseus paradox reflects this legal perspective. If a ship is regularly repaired and maintained so it can keep serving its purpose, the law might still recognize it as the same ship, even if all its parts are new. However, if the original materials were rebuilt into another ship, the legal questions could become complicated. Which ship should legally be called the Ship of Theseus? And how would that decision affect ownership, history, or cultural value? The paradox also connects with biology and modern technology. In the natural world, living organisms constantly change through growth and repair. For example, human cells are continually replaced, yet we still consider a person to be the same individual throughout life. This biological example encourages us to think about how identity can remain stable even when individual parts change. The idea of biological identity suggests that life, consciousness, and function allow an organism to stay the same even while its components are replaced. Technology shows similar situations. Imagine a computer that has been upgraded many times over the years with new hardware parts. Even though the internal components have changed, the computer may still be seen as the same machine because it continues to perform the same tasks and serve the same role. This situation shows the importance of functional continuity, where identity is maintained through purpose and activity rather than through materials. The Ship of Theseus paradox also raises important ethical and philosophical questions about identity and change. One major issue involves personal identity and the meaning of life and death. As people experience physical and mental changes, what ensures that they remain the same person? This question becomes especially important when discussing consciousness and personal identity. If a person keeps their memories, thoughts, and experiences even as their body changes, does that continuity of consciousness allow them to remain the same individual? Philosophers have suggested several ideas to answer this question. One example is psychological continuity theory, which argues that identity remains the same as long as a person's memories, personality, and mental characteristics continue over time. According to this theory, even major physical changes would not destroy personal identity as long as consciousness remains continuous. Another philosophical idea is narrative identity. According to this view, identity is not only based on the body or the mind, but also on the story of a person's life. This perspective suggests that people understand themselves through the stories they tell about their experiences. As long as the story of a person's life remains meaningful and connected, their identity continues. The Ship of Theseus paradox can also be applied to cultures and societies. In many societies, traditions and symbols change over time but still keep their original meaning. Religious objects, monuments, and national symbols are often repaired or altered, yet they continue to represent the same cultural values and history. This cultural continuity shows that identity can depend on shared meaning rather than just physical materials. In a similar way, social institutions also change over time. For example, a university or government office may experience many changes in buildings, leaders, and rules. Even with these changes, people may still recognize the institution as the same organization because it continues to serve the same purpose within society. In conclusion, the Ship of Theseus paradox provides deep insights into the meaning of identity and transformation. By exploring ideas such as functional continuity, legal identity, and personal identity, we gain a clearer understanding of how objects, people, and institutions can remain the same even while experiencing major changes. The paradox encourages us to question our assumptions about identity and invites us to think more carefully about the relationship between physical parts, purpose, and meaning. Dichotomy Paradox. Zeno's Dichotomy Paradox is a deeply interesting thought experiment that examines the meaning of motion and infinity. Imagine that you are preparing to run a race. According to Zeno, before you can arrive at the finish line, you must first travel half the distance toward it. After you reach that halfway mark, you must then travel half of the distance that still remains. After that, you must again cover half of what is left, and this process continues forever. At first, this may seem simple, but it creates a very puzzling question. How can you ever arrive at the finish line if there are infinitely many smaller distances still waiting to be crossed? To picture this more clearly, imagine yourself running forward. At the beginning, you travel half of the full distance. Once you arrive there, you then need to move through half of the remaining distance. You continue dividing the space ahead of you in half, again and again, creating a never-ending series of actions. It appears that no matter how far you go, there is always some distance still left in front of you. This endless division suggests that you should never actually reach the finish line, and that creates a paradox. How can a limited journey ever be completed if it contains an infinite number of parts? This paradox challenges the natural way we think about space and movement. In ordinary life, we act as though we can move from one place to another without facing endless barriers. Yet, Zeno's paradox suggests that if there are infinitely many parts to cross, finishing a trip should be impossible. Zeno's paradox was not only a mathematical problem, it was also a philosophical challenge. Zeno followed the ideas of Parmenides, who claimed that change and motion are only illusions. By presenting the dichotomy paradox, Zeno tried to show that the idea of motion creates logical contradictions. If you must pass through an infinite number of stages, then it seems that motion itself cannot really happen. The paradox pushes us to question reality and to rethink how we understand space and time. It causes us to wonder whether our natural understanding of motion is mistaken. If an infinite process is needed in order to complete a finite action, does that mean motion is impossible at its core? Zeno of Elea, an ancient Greek philosopher, used this paradox to defend the philosophy of Parmenides. Parmenides believed that reality never changes and that our senses mislead us when they show us movement and change. Zeno's paradoxes, including the Dichotomy Paradox, were created to reveal contradictions in the idea of motion and transformation. By describing these puzzling situations, Zeno challenged the thinkers of his time to question their beliefs about the true nature of reality. He used paradoxes to point out what he believed were logical weaknesses in the ideas of motion and change. Today, although the Dichotomy Paradox still presents an interesting challenge, modern mathematics gives us a way to answer it. Calculus, developed by mathematicians such as Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, provides tools for understanding infinite processes and smooth motion. Through calculus, we learn that even though there are infinitely many parts, those parts become small quickly enough to let us finish a limited journey. This modern explanation helps us understand how infinite processes can still produce finite results. It also shows that while Zeno's paradox raises a theoretical difficulty, it does not stop us from experiencing and understanding motion in everyday life. In daily life, we often face tasks that seem endless but still get finished. For example, when working on a project or trying to solve a difficult problem, we may feel overwhelmed by how many steps are involved. Even so, we still manage to finish the task, showing that even when something appears almost infinite, we can still reach our goal. Zeno's Dichotomy Paradox, though created in ancient times, remains a strong reminder of how complex motion and infinity can be. It encourages us to think about our perceptions and to value the ways that mathematics and philosophy help us understand the world around us. So, how does this match what we actually experience in real life? In practical reality, people do reach the places they are moving toward, despite the idea of infinite steps. The important point is understanding how endless division can still produce a journey with a final end. Imagine that you are walking toward a goal, such as moving across a room. If you think of that trip as being divided into smaller and smaller pieces, it may help explain the paradox. Each movement may seem to become smaller and smaller, but your progress continues. In the end, you still arrive at the other side of the room. This shows that even if there are infinitely many divisions in theory, the full journey can still be completed. This idea matters because it shows that while there may be infinitely many parts in theory, those parts become so tiny that their effect becomes almost meaningless. The idea of infinite steps does not keep you from arriving where you want to go. Instead, it shows that the steps become so small that they do not block your forward movement. Think about ordinary tasks that may feel endless but still get done. For example, if you are putting together a piece of furniture, you may have a long list of instructions, with each one requiring small and careful changes. Even though the process may seem complicated, you still complete the task in the end. This reflects the idea that although there may be many small parts to a process, the whole thing can still be finished. Another example is writing a book. You begin with an empty page and slowly fill it with words, sentence after sentence, and paragraph after paragraph. Every stage of writing may seem like only a tiny step, but together, those steps build a finished manuscript. The seemingly endless nature of the task, in theory, does not stop the book from eventually being completed. The Dichotomy Paradox also encourages us to think about how we understand time and movement. It challenges our natural view of these ideas by suggesting that an infinite chain should stop us from reaching an ending. In reality, though, our experience of time and motion feels smooth and unbroken. From a psychological point of view, facing tasks that seem endless can feel exhausting. However, understanding that small and steady progress leads to a completed result helps us handle and finish those tasks. This practical way of thinking fits with the solution to the paradox, showing that even with theoretical difficulties, we can still achieve what we aim for. The dichotomy paradox has affected many different fields, including mathematics, philosophy, and even popular culture. It shows the importance of understanding how infinite processes work and how they connect to our finite experiences. In mathematics, the paradox encouraged the growth of new ideas for dealing with infinite series and continuity. In philosophy and culture, it acts as a symbol for exploring the limits of human understanding and the nature of reality. It encourages us to think carefully about how we experience and imagine the world, pushing the edge of our knowledge and intuition. Zeno's dichotomy paradox was not only a philosophical question, it also played an important part in the growth of mathematical ideas. Although Zeno himself did not solve the paradox, his paradoxes inspired later mathematicians to develop methods for handling infinite processes. One of the most important advances was the development of calculus by Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in the 17th century. Calculus gives us a system for understanding how infinite processes can create finite results. It uses ideas such as limits and infinite decimals to explain how an endless series of smaller and smaller distances can add together into one limited total. This mathematical discovery allowed scientists and engineers to solve difficult problems involving motion, growth, and change. For example, calculus is used to describe the movement of planets, predict how physical systems behave, and study economic patterns. By addressing the problems raised by Zeno's paradox, calculus became a basic tool in many branches of science. The dichotomy paradox still encourages philosophical reflection about reality and our understanding of motion. It challenges our intuition about how space and time operate. If an infinite number of parts can be completed in a limited amount of time, then what does that tell us about infinity and continuity? Philosophers have used this paradox to examine questions about existence and the limits of human knowledge. It raises serious questions about whether our experience of time and space truly matches the deeper nature of reality. By thinking through these questions, we gain a richer understanding of existence and our place in the universe. Beyond mathematics and philosophy, Zeno's dichotomy paradox has also influenced popular culture and creative thought. It appears in literature, movies, and art as a symbol of the difficulties and mysteries involved in understanding infinity and motion. In literature, writers have used the paradox to explore ideas about time, perception, and reality itself. Science fiction writers especially have drawn from the paradox when creating imaginative situations that challenge our ideas of space and time. For example, stories about time travel or endless worlds often reflect the same kinds of questions raised by Zeno's paradox. Works of art have also used the paradox to explore the idea of infinity. Artists have created images that capture the feeling of an endless process or an infinite pattern, showing the paradox's effect on the way we think about space and form. Zeno's dichotomy paradox works as a useful teaching tool for introducing ideas connected to infinity, continuity, and mathematical reasoning. It offers a strong example of how philosophical questions can lead to major advances in mathematics and science. By studying Zeno's paradox, students and scholars can explore basic ideas about motion and infinity, while also appreciating the history of mathematical and philosophical thought. The paradox encourages critical thinking and helps learners build a deeper understanding of how abstract ideas can be connected to real-world problems. In summary, Zeno's dichotomy paradox is more than just an old puzzle. It is a doorway into exploring deep questions about motion, infinity, and reality. Its influence reaches across mathematics, philosophy, culture, and education. By studying this paradox, we gain valuable understanding of how we make sense of the world and how we approach difficult problems. The Dichotomy Paradox continues to inspire and challenge us, reminding us of the limits of intuition and the strength of human reasoning. As we reflect on its meaning, we can appreciate the ways that ancient ideas continue to shape and deepen our understanding of the universe. Barber Paradox. The Barber Paradox was presented by Bertrand Russell in the early 20th century. It is a famous example of a self-referring paradox that reveals major problems in logic and set theory. To understand the paradox, imagine a small town with only one barber who follows one very strict rule. He shaves all and only those men who do not shave themselves. This rule may sound simple at first, but it quickly creates a puzzling question: does the barber shave himself? To understand this paradox better, we need to think about what the barber's rule means. If the barber shaves himself, then according to his own rule, he should not shave himself. The rule clearly says that the barber shaves only those men who do not shave themselves. So, if the barber is one of the men who shaves himself, then he cannot belong to the group of men he shaves, and that creates a contradiction. On the other hand, if the barber does not shave himself, then he must be one of the men the barber is supposed to shave under the rule. This also creates a contradiction, because if he does not shave himself, then the barber should shave him. This paradox shows a basic problem inside self-referring systems. It reveals that when we create a set or a rule that includes or excludes itself, logical contradictions can appear. The Barber Paradox is one clear example of a larger group of self-referring paradoxes that challenge the consistency of formal systems. These paradoxes make it difficult for us to sort and define sets in ways that stay free from contradiction. Russell's paradox, including the Barber Paradox, appeared during a period when mathematicians were trying to build a strong foundation for mathematics. The early 20th century included major efforts to organize mathematical logic and set theory into formal systems. However, the discovery of paradoxes, like Russell's, showed serious weaknesses in these systems. The paradox proved that certain simple approaches to set theory, where sets could be defined by referring to themselves, were deeply flawed. The Barber Paradox is not only a theoretical problem, it also has real importance for how we understand and organize formal systems. It forces us to rethink the rules and definitions we use when grouping and analyzing sets. By giving us a situation where a barber's self-referring rule creates a contradiction, Russell's paradox shows why mathematics and logic need stronger and more careful frameworks. As we explore the paradox more deeply, we can see how it affected the growth of modern logic and set theory. The Barber Paradox acts as a starting point for improving and reshaping formal systems so they can deal with self-reference and avoid contradiction. Understanding this paradox is important if we want to appreciate how mathematical logic developed and why people continue trying to create formal systems that are both consistent and dependable. To understand the full depth of the Barber Paradox, it is necessary to study its logical and philosophical meaning. The paradox does more than show a simple contradiction. It also explores the difficulties of self-reference and formal systems. Understanding these ideas requires us to examine how the paradox connects to wider logical problems and how it influenced modern mathematics and philosophy. At its heart, the Barber Paradox challenges the way we understand set theory and self-reference. It questions whether it makes sense to create sets or rules that refer back to themselves. This self-referring feature is exactly where the paradox begins. The barber's rule creates a situation where the barber's position as a member of the group he shaves leads directly to contradiction. This reflects a more general issue in formal logic. How can we deal with statements or sets that refer to themselves without creating inconsistency? One major logical issue shown by the paradox is the problem of defining a set that includes or excludes itself. This issue does not belong only to the Barber Paradox, but appears in many self-referring paradoxes. For example, Russell's famous paradox describes a set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Both paradoxes reveal the weaknesses of simple set theory, where sets can be defined without limits on what may belong to them. The Barber Paradox also demonstrates the broader idea of self-reference in logic. Self-reference happens when a statement or rule points back to itself, creating a loop that can produce contradiction. In formal logic, handling self-reference requires careful rules and limits, so paradoxical results do not appear. The paradox works as a warning example of the danger of self-referring definitions and the need for stricter logical systems. In response to paradoxes such as the Barber Paradox, mathematicians and philosophers created several methods to solve problems connected to self-reference. One solution was to change the basic principles of set theory. For example, type theory, introduced by Bertrand Russell himself, offers an answer by placing sets into different types, so self-reference cannot happen. In this system, sets are arranged in levels, and a set of one type cannot contain sets of the same or higher type. This structure blocks self-referring definitions and prevents the paradoxes connected with them. Another important solution is Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, which uses the axiom of regularity and other restrictions to avoid paradoxes. The axiom of regularity, also called the axiom of foundation, makes sure that no set can be a member of itself, which stops self-referring definitions that would lead to contradiction. Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory offers a more stable framework for handling sets and avoids the contradictions revealed by the Barber Paradox and related problems. These responses show how mathematical logic changed over time in order to deal with paradoxes and protect consistency in formal systems. They reflect the ongoing effort to improve and strengthen the foundations of mathematics after the challenges created by paradoxes. Beyond mathematics, the Barber Paradox also has philosophical meaning for the way we understand formal systems and self-reference. It raises major questions about the nature of definitions and the limits of formal reasoning. The paradox shows why precise definitions and clear restrictions are necessary inside any formal system if contradiction is to be avoided. From a philosophical point of view, the paradox also connects to questions about language and meaning. It challenges our ability to create rules and definitions that remain consistent when self-reference is involved. The paradox highlights how difficult it can be to formalize concepts and why it is important to build systems carefully so they do not collapse into contradiction. To fully understand the importance of the Barber Paradox, we must look at its effect on fields beyond pure logic and set theory. This paradox not only influenced the development of mathematical systems, but also left a lasting effect on computer science, philosophy, and the study of formal systems. By looking at these different areas, we can better understand how the Barber Paradox helped shape modern thinking. The Barber Paradox has important consequences for computer science, especially in programming and database theory. Self-referring paradoxes reveal difficulties in creating algorithms and systems that must work with recursive definitions and queries. In programming, recursion is a common method where functions call themselves. While recursion is very useful, it can create problems if it is not controlled correctly. The Barber Paradox shows the kind of trouble that can come from self-referring structures. In database theory, similar problems appear when working with recursive queries and layered data systems. For example, imagine a database that represents an organization where one employee may supervise others, and those workers may supervise more people below them, forming a hierarchy. Searching through these recursive structures requires careful planning, so paradoxical results or endless loops do not occur. The lessons learned from paradoxes like the Barber Paradox help engineers create stronger database systems that can manage recursion without falling into contradiction. The Barber Paradox also connects with philosophical questions about truth, self-reference, and the limits of human thinking. Philosophers have long struggled with the problem of how self-referring statements can create paradoxes and what this tells us about meaning and truth. The Barber Paradox works as a clear example of how self-reference can cause logical trouble, encouraging deeper thought about the nature of statements and their consistency. In cognitive science, the paradox shows the challenges people face when dealing with complicated self-referring systems. Understanding and solving such paradoxes requires advanced reasoning skills. By studying the way people think about and respond to paradoxes, researchers learn more about human thought and the limits of our logical abilities. In education, the Barber Paradox is often used to explain important ideas in logic and mathematics. It serves as a useful teaching example for showing the difficulties of self-reference and the importance of formal definitions. Teachers use the paradox to encourage careful thinking and to show why logical systems must be designed with care if contradictions are to be avoided. Teaching the Barber Paradox also introduces students to the wider world of paradoxes and their importance in mathematical and philosophical discussion. By exploring the paradox, students learn about the history of logical systems and the continuing effort to solve basic problems in mathematics. The paradox helps students understand why precision and consistency matter so much in formal reasoning. The Barber Paradox has also entered cultural and literary discussion as a symbol of the complexity of logic and self-reference. In literature, self-referring paradoxes often appear as themes that explore identity, truth, and the nature of reality. The Barber Paradox, like many other logical paradoxes, works as a metaphor for the struggle to understand and define difficult ideas. In popular culture, references to paradoxes and self-reference are often used to interest audiences in challenging ideas. Films and books that explore recursion and self-reference often draw on the ideas shown by the Barber Paradox. These cultural examples help spread the ideas connected with formal logic and paradoxes, making them easier for a wider audience to understand. The Barber Paradox reaches far beyond its beginning in set theory and logic. Its influence spreads across computer science, philosophy, education, and popular culture. By studying its effect in these different fields, we gain a deeper respect for the paradox's importance and the continuing efforts to solve the problems it presents. In the end, the Barber Paradox reminds us of the complexity involved in formal reasoning and the need for strong frameworks to manage self-referring structures. As we continue trying to understand these issues, the paradox remains a powerful tool for exploring the limits of human thought and the nature of formal systems. Paradox of choice. The paradox of choice focuses on an unusual and surprising idea. Having more options does not always increase happiness or satisfaction. In many situations, it can actually lead to greater frustration and disappointment. This idea became widely known through the work of psychologist Barry Schwartz in his book, Times, The Paradox of Choice, Why More is Less. To understand this idea clearly, consider a simple situation. Imagine that you walk into an ice cream shop where there are 10 different flavors available. At first, having so many flavors seems exciting because it appears to give you the freedom to select exactly what you want. However, when you are faced with many choices at once, you may begin to feel confused or overwhelmed, making it harder to decide. This feeling of being overwhelmed can cause worry, hesitation, and even disappointment with the choice you finally make. Schwartz explains that several factors contribute to this paradox. One important factor is decision fatigue. When people must evaluate a large number of options, their minds become tired from comparing and judging each one. This mental exhaustion can make it harder to feel satisfied with a decision and may even cause people to avoid making a decision at all. In some cases, individuals may experience decision paralysis, which means they feel unable to choose because none of the options seem completely correct. Another important factor is the feeling of regret. When many choices are available, people often question whether they made the best decision. They may worry that another option might have been better, which creates feelings of regret. These feelings can reduce the happiness that should come from the chosen option and leave people less satisfied overall. Another influence comes from the expectation of perfection. When there are many choices available, people may believe that the perfect option must exist somewhere among them. Because of this belief, they may spend a long time searching for the ideal choice. However, even the best options may still feel disappointing if they fail to match the perfect image imagined in the mind. The paradox also shows how having too many options can affect personal well-being. Research suggests that when individuals face a very large number of choices, they often feel less satisfied and more stressed. The effort needed to compare many possibilities can create a sense of overload and leave people feeling unhappy with the final decision. As we continue to examine this paradox, it is important to think about how the many choices we face in everyday life, such as buying products, choosing careers, or forming relationships, can influence our happiness and overall well-being. To understand the paradox of choice more deeply, we must look at the psychological processes that help explain it. Several important ideas explain why having too many options may lead to anxiety and dissatisfaction. One key idea is the difference between maximization and satisficing. Maximizers are people who want to find the absolute best option available. They often spend a great deal of time examining every possibility because they want the most perfect result. On the other hand, satisficers are people who are comfortable choosing an option that simply meets their needs. They do not feel the need to search endlessly for the perfect solution. Research shows that maximizers are more likely to experience stress and regret because they constantly wonder whether their choice was truly the best one. As a result, they may feel less satisfied than satisficers, who tend to feel more content with their decisions. Another important concept connected to the paradox is choice paralysis. When people are confronted with too many options, they may find it extremely difficult to decide. This hesitation can lead to long delays or even complete avoidance of making a decision. The frustration and pressure created by this situation can reduce satisfaction and produce negative emotions. Self-doubt is another factor that contributes to the paradox of choice. When people have many options available, they may begin to question their decisions. They might wonder whether they selected the correct option or whether a better one existed. This self-doubt often grows stronger because of the fear of missing out on a better opportunity. As people continue questioning their decision, their enjoyment of the chosen option becomes weaker. Social comparison also plays an important role in this paradox. When there are many possible choices, people often compare their decisions with the choices made by others. This comparison can create feelings of disappointment if someone believes that another person made a better choice. As a result, individuals may feel less satisfied with their own decision, even if it was a good one. Another major factor is the idea of opportunity cost. Every time a decision is made, other options must be left behind. When the number of choices increases, the number of possibilities that must be given up also increases. People become more aware of what they might be missing, and this awareness can reduce their satisfaction with the option they selected. The paradox of choice has important effects in many parts of life, including consumer behavior, career planning, and personal relationships. By studying real-life situations and learning ways to manage choice overload, we can understand how to deal with this paradox more effectively. In consumer behavior, one of the clearest examples of the paradox of choice can be seen in shopping environments. When shoppers are offered too many products, they may experience choice overload. This overload can reduce the enjoyment of buying something. A famous study involving jam choices found that customers were more likely to purchase a jar of jam when they were shown a smaller selection rather than a very large one. When the selection was larger, customers spent more time thinking and comparing, which made them less satisfied with their final choice. The paradox of choice also appears when people make career decisions. With so many job opportunities and career paths available, individuals may struggle to choose one direction. The pressure to select the best possible career can cause analysis paralysis, where the person delays making a decision because they fear choosing the wrong option. Even after a decision is made, individuals may continue wondering whether another career might have been better. In personal relationships, the paradox can appear in modern dating. Because dating applications and social networks provide access to many possible partners, people may feel overwhelmed by the number of options. This abundance can make it harder to commit to one person, because individuals may continue wondering if a better match exists somewhere else. As a result, satisfaction in relationships may decrease. To deal with the paradox of choice and reduce its negative effects, several strategies can be used. One helpful method is decision simplification, which involves reducing the number of options and focusing on the most important criteria. By doing this, people can lower the mental effort required to make a decision and feel more satisfied with their choice. For example, choosing a few key priorities and removing less important options can make the process easier. Limiting choices is another effective strategy. When individuals intentionally reduce the number of possibilities they consider, decision-making becomes simpler and more satisfying. For instance, while shopping, selecting only a few products to compare can help people decide more quickly and feel happier with their purchase. Another useful approach is adopting a satisficing mindset instead of a maximizing one. Accepting that a decision does not need to be perfect can greatly reduce stress and pressure. By focusing on options that meet basic needs rather than searching for the absolute best, people can experience greater peace of mind and satisfaction. Finally, practicing gratitude and acceptance can help individuals appreciate the choices they make. When people focus on the positive aspects of their decision and accept that every choice involves some compromise, they can reduce feelings of regret. This mindset encourages satisfaction and helps people avoid the negative effects of choice overload. In conclusion, the paradox of choice offers important insight into the complicated nature of decision-making and the effects of having too many options. By understanding the psychological reasons behind this paradox and learning ways to manage choices more effectively, individuals can make decisions with greater confidence and enjoy greater satisfaction in the outcomes they select. Bootstrap Paradox. The Bootstrap Paradox, sometimes called the causal loop or ontological paradox, challenges the way we normally understand time and cause and effect. It appears in situations involving time travel, where an object or piece of knowledge is sent into the past and eventually becomes the reason for its own existence. This situation creates a repeating loop that continues by itself and does not have a clear starting point. To understand this paradox more clearly, imagine a well-known example. A traveler from the future moves back in time while carrying a copy of a famous novel. The traveler gives the book to a young writer who dreams of becoming an author. After reading the novel, the young writer becomes inspired and eventually grows up to become a successful writer. Later in life, this writer creates the exact same book that the traveler originally brought back in time. In this repeating loop, the book appears to exist without any true beginning. It seems as though it appeared from nowhere. The paradox shows the strange idea of causal loops, where cause and effect circle back and influence each other. In the case of the Bootstrap Paradox, the existence of the book creates its own past. This creates a situation where the book does not have a clear moment when it was first written. Instead, the book remains trapped inside a repeating loop of its own creation. Understanding the Bootstrap Paradox requires thinking about ideas related to time travel and how they affect our understanding of cause and effect. Time travel introduces the possibility that someone could move into the past and change earlier events. When this happens, it can create situations where outcomes cause themselves. In the Bootstrap Paradox, the object or information travels into the past and becomes responsible for its own creation, which raises serious questions about how time and causality are connected. In traditional physics, time is usually seen as moving in a straight line, progressing clearly from the past to the present and then into the future. However, the Bootstrap Paradox introduces a different view in which events can circle back and connect with themselves. This circular structure challenges our normal understanding of cause and effect because it breaks the usual order in which events happen. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of information and existence. If an object or piece of knowledge can exist without a clear origin, it forces us to question how things truly come into existence. Normally, we assume that every object or idea must have a specific starting point in time. The Bootstrap Paradox challenges that belief by presenting a situation where something seems to exist without ever being created. As we study the Bootstrap Paradox more closely, it becomes important to think about what it means for our understanding of time travel and causal relationships. The paradox challenges traditional ideas about how time works and suggests that time travel might allow events to loop back on themselves, producing complicated and puzzling results. It also raises deeper philosophical questions about the origin of objects and information and how existence itself should be understood. The second part of the Bootstrap Paradox looks more carefully at the structure of the causal loop and examines how it changes our understanding of time and cause and effect. By studying different examples and theoretical consequences, we can gain a clearer understanding of the paradox. To explore the paradox further, imagine another example similar to the earlier story. Suppose a time traveler carries a blueprint for a very advanced machine back into the past. The traveler gives this blueprint to a scientist living in an earlier time. The scientist studies the blueprint and uses it to build the machine. Later, that same machine is used to send the blueprint back in time to the traveler, completing the loop. In this situation, the blueprint exists without any clear point of creation, forming a self-sustaining loop of cause and effect. This example demonstrates the repeating structure found in the Bootstrap Paradox. The blueprint and the machine depend on each other in such a way that neither seems to come first. Each one exists because of the other. The result is a loop where both the blueprint and the machine appear to exist without an original moment when they were first invented. This repeating structure challenges the normal way we understand cause and effect, where events usually begin with a clear starting point. The paradox also raises questions about whether such loops could remain stable. If an object or piece of information is trapped inside a loop of self-creation, even a small change might disrupt the entire cycle. For example, if the blueprint or the machine were slightly altered, the loop might break and create contradictions within the timeline. This raises doubts about whether such loops could remain consistent and stable over time. Another important part of the Bootstrap Paradox is the challenge it creates for logical consistency. The paradox questions the basic principles of logic and causality by suggesting that events can happen without a clear cause. Normally, we believe that every effect must come from a cause, and that causes always happen before their effects. The Bootstrap Paradox disrupts this simple idea by showing a situation where cause and effect form a loop without any clear beginning. The paradox also connects to discussions about free will and determinism. If events exist inside a causal loop, it raises questions about whether our choices are truly free. it may be possible that the loop itself determines what happens. In this way, the paradox suggests that if time travel and causal loops are possible, they might lead to a universe where events are predetermined by the loop itself. As we continue exploring the Bootstrap Paradox, it becomes important to think about its wider effects on how we understand time travel and reality. The paradox challenges the ideas we normally hold about time and cause and effect, suggesting that time travel might produce complex situations where events circle back on themselves. The final part of the Bootstrap Paradox explores its larger meaning for reality, time, and causality. By examining how the paradox influences these ideas, we gain a deeper understanding of the problems and questions it raises. One major consequence of the Bootstrap Paradox concerns our understanding of reality itself. The paradox challenges the belief that objects and information must always have a clear origin. By presenting a situation where something exists inside a causal loop, the paradox forces us to question whether every object truly needs a starting point in time. It encourages us to rethink the idea that an initial cause is always required to explain existence. The paradox also affects our understanding of time. It suggests that time may not always move in a straight line, and that events could potentially loop back into earlier moments. This circular view challenges the traditional idea that time always moves steadily from the past to the present and then into the future. Instead, it invites us to consider other models of time, such as cyclical or multidimensional ideas that might better explain causal loops. When it comes to causality, the Bootstrap Paradox disrupts the usual belief that every effect must follow a cause. Instead, it presents a situation where cause and effect become connected in a continuous loop. This challenges the linear idea of causality found in classical physics and suggests that our understanding of cause and effect may need to change if time travel is possible. The Bootstrap Paradox also shapes the way we think about time travel and its possible consequences. If time travel and causal loops could exist, they might create puzzling situations that challenge the way we understand the universe. The paradox encourages us to consider how traveling through time might change events and whether such situations could happen without producing contradictions. Finally, the paradox invites us to think about knowledge and information in a new way. By describing a situation where knowledge exists within a causal loop, the paradox challenges our understanding of how information begins and spreads. It raises questions about how knowledge shapes reality and whether our current ideas about information are enough to explain complex situations involving time travel. In conclusion, the Bootstrap Paradox offers a fascinating and thought-provoking exploration of time, causality, and reality. By studying the ideas it presents, we gain a deeper understanding of the challenges it creates for our understanding of these concepts. The paradox encourages us to question our assumptions and explore new ways of thinking about time travel and its possible effects on the universe. Sorites Paradox. The Sorites Paradox, often called the paradox of the heap, presents a deeply puzzling problem that challenges the way we understand categories, definitions, and the idea of vagueness. This paradox has interested philosophers for hundreds of years because it shows how difficult it can be to draw clear boundaries when changes happen slowly and step by step. To understand this paradox properly, we first need to examine where it came from, what vagueness means, and how these ideas connect to the Sorites Paradox. The Sorites Paradox gets its name from the Greek word times soros, which means heap. The paradox is usually connected to the ancient Greek philosopher Eubulides of Miletus, who introduced the problem while discussing the question of when a group of grains of sand becomes a heap. The traditional version of the paradox is explained in a simple way. One grain of sand is clearly not a heap. If you add one grain of sand to something that is not a heap, it still does not become a heap. If this idea continues step by step, it seems that no matter how many grains are added, a heap should never form. The paradox appears when we realize that at some point, a large collection of sand grains clearly does become a heap. However, according to the logic of the argument, we cannot point to the exact moment or number of grains when the change happens. This missing boundary challenges our understanding of categories and shows how slow changes can eventually lead to major differences. At the center of the Sorites Paradox is the idea of vagueness. Vagueness happens when the limits of a concept or category are not clearly defined, creating cases where it becomes difficult to decide whether something belongs to that category or not. In the example of the Sorites Paradox, the word heap is vague because it does not tell us the exact number of sand grains required before something can be called a heap. Vagueness is not limited only to piles of sand. It appears in many areas of language and everyday thinking. For example, think about words like tall, rich, or old. Each of these descriptions is vague because there is no exact point where someone suddenly becomes tall, wealthy, or elderly. The Sorites Paradox can easily apply to these situations as well. If $1 does not make a person rich, and adding one more dollar does not make them rich either, then when exactly does someone become rich? In the same way, if a person who is 20 years old is not considered old, and adding 1 year does not suddenly make them old, when does the change occur? The Sorites Paradox shows the problems that vagueness creates for logical thinking. It forces us to recognize the limits of traditional logic, which normally assumes that categories have clear definitions and that every statement is either true or false. When we deal with vague ideas, this simple system does not work well, and paradoxes, like the Sorites Paradox, appear. One possible response to the paradox might be to insist that there must be a specific number of grains where the heap begins, even if we cannot identify it exactly. However, this explanation is not very satisfying because it ignores the gradual way the change happens. The paradox continues to exist because our language and concepts do not always match the slow transitions we see in the real world. The meaning of the Sorites Paradox goes far beyond the example of sand grains. It raises wider questions about how we use language, how we create categories, and how we interpret the world around us. The paradox challenges the belief that every concept must have exact and clear boundaries. Instead, it suggests that many of our everyday ideas are naturally vague and difficult to define precisely. The Sorites Paradox also encourages us to rethink the nature of logic itself. If traditional logic struggles to deal with vagueness, which appears so often in normal language and thought, then new forms of logic might be needed to handle these situations more effectively. Because of this paradox, philosophers have explored different systems of reasoning that can better deal with vague concepts and gradual change. The Sorites Paradox challenges more than just our ideas about categories. It also raises deeper questions about logic, meaning, and the philosophy of language. The paradox suggests that the tools of classical logic may not always be strong enough to deal with vague ideas. This realization has led philosophers to search for different ways of understanding and resolving the problem. Traditional logic depends on the principle of bivalence, which states that every statement must be either true or false. This rule supports many forms of reasoning, from mathematics to everyday thinking. However, the Sorites Paradox reveals an important weakness in this rule. It becomes difficult to apply when a statement cannot easily be placed into one category or the other. For instance, when considering the Sorites Paradox, the statement, "This is a heap of sand," may not clearly be true or false in situations where the pile is very small. If there are about 50 grains of sand, is it truly a heap or not? The paradox forces us to ask whether every statement must always be either true or false, or whether some situations fall between these two categories. Philosophers have suggested several theories to deal with vagueness and the Sorites Paradox. One idea is called epistemicism. This theory claims that there actually is a precise boundary between a heap and something that is not a heap, but human beings simply cannot discover it. According to epistemicists, the vagueness of words like heap comes from our limited knowledge rather than from the absence of a real boundary. This theory protects the rule that every statement must be true or false, even if we cannot identify the exact dividing line. Another solution is known as fuzzy logic. This approach rejects the idea that statements must always be completely true or completely false. Instead, fuzzy logic allows statements to have degrees of truth. In the case of the Sorites Paradox, rather than asking whether a group of sand grains is or is not a heap, fuzzy logic measures how strongly it fits the idea of a heap. A small pile might be considered partly a heap, while a larger pile might be closer to being fully a heap. This idea reflects our natural understanding that changes happen gradually rather than suddenly. Another philosophical response is called supervaluationism. According to this view, vague words may not have exact boundaries, but we can still reason about them by considering all possible, precise interpretations. These interpretations are known as precisifications. A statement is considered true if it is true in every interpretation, false if it is false in every interpretation, and uncertain if it varies between them. In the Sorites Paradox, this approach suggests that some piles of sand are clearly heaps, some are clearly not, and some exist in the uncertain middle area. The Sorites Paradox also affects the way we think about language and meaning. If many of our words are vague and difficult to define exactly, then much of our thinking depends on concepts that are naturally unclear. This situation raises deeper questions about the nature of meaning itself. Are meanings fixed and exact, or are they flexible and shaped by the situation in which they are used? Some philosophers, including Ludwig Wittgenstein, argued that the meaning of a word comes from how it is used rather than from a strict definition. According to this view, the idea of a heap does not depend on a precise number of grains of sand, but on how people use the word in everyday situations. This perspective shifts attention away from searching for exact boundaries and instead focuses on how language works in practice. Another important element in understanding vagueness is the role of context. In many situations, what counts as a heap or any other vague category depends strongly on the circumstances in which the word is used. For example, when cleaning a beach, even a small pile of sand might be called a heap. However, when building a sandcastle, the same pile might not seem large enough to deserve that label. This idea leads to a theory called contextualism, which states that the meaning of vague terms changes depending on the situation. According to contextualism, our judgments about categories are often shaped by the purpose of the conversation, the speaker's goals, and social expectations. The Sorites Paradox also has important practical effects in areas such as law, medicine, ethics, and public policy. In legal systems, laws often include vague terms such as reasonable, sufficient, or negligent. Because these words are not precisely defined, difficult cases can arise where it is unclear how the law should apply. In medical ethics, similar problems can appear in decisions about the end of life. Terms like quality of life or terminal illness may not have clear definitions, and small changes in a patient's condition may not clearly mark the transition from one category to another. Public policy faces similar issues. Governments often rely on categories such as poverty, risk, or eligibility for assistance programs. Although these categories may use numerical measures, the Sorites Paradox reminds us that the boundaries chosen are often somewhat arbitrary. The paradox also raises ethical concerns related to gradual change. For example, telling one small lie may not seem very serious, but repeating small lies again and again can eventually lead to serious moral consequences. In environmental ethics, the same idea appears. A single act of pollution may seem unimportant, but many small actions repeated over time can produce major environmental damage. The Sorites Paradox shows how difficult it can be to decide when a series of small actions becomes a serious problem. The paradox also affects modern technology, especially in artificial intelligence and machine learning. Computer systems often require clear categories in order to classify information or make decisions. However, many real-world ideas are vague and do not have strict boundaries. For instance, an artificial intelligence program designed to detect unwanted email must decide when a message should be classified as spam. The Sorites Paradox shows how difficult it can be to create rules for situations where the categories are not perfectly clear. In the end, the Sorites Paradox reminds us of the complexity and uncertainty present in everyday language and reasoning. By revealing how difficult it is to draw exact boundaries around vague concepts, the paradox challenges the foundations of classical logic and encourages the development of more flexible ways of thinking. The different philosophical responses, such as epistemicism, fuzzy logic, and contextualism, show several ways people have tried to deal with vagueness while still allowing meaningful reasoning. Whether in philosophy, law, ethics, technology, or daily life, the Sorites Paradox reminds us that many distinctions we rely on are not as precise as they may appear. As people continue to explore the meaning of vagueness, the Sorites Paradox remains one of the most important philosophical puzzles. It encourages ongoing reflection and deeper understanding of how we classify and interpret the world around us. Paradox of the unexpected examination. The paradox of the unexpected examination is a logical puzzle that examines the conflict between prediction and surprise. It begins with a teacher telling a class that they will have an exam at some point during the coming week, but the test will be a surprise. The paradox asks students to think about how an exam can be planned ahead of time while still remaining unexpected. The situation begins when the teacher announces that the exam will take place on one day during the week, but the students will not know in advance which day it will happen. The important rule is that the test must occur on a day when the students do not expect it. Because of this condition, the students begin trying to figure out exactly which day the exam could happen. At first, the students may think about the possibility that the exam could happen on Friday. However, they quickly notice a problem. If Thursday night arrives and the exam has not happened yet, then the exam must occur on Friday. This means the students would expect the test, and it would no longer be a surprise. Because of this reasoning, they decide that the exam cannot be held on Friday. After eliminating Friday, the students continue thinking about Thursday. They reason that if Wednesday ends and the exam still has not happened, then it must occur on Thursday. Once again, this would mean the students could predict the test in advance, and it would not be surprising. Because of this, they remove Thursday from the list of possible days as well. The same reasoning continues step by step backward through the week. The students eventually convince themselves that the exam cannot happen on any day at all. According to their logic, every possible day would allow them to predict the exam beforehand, which would break the rule that it must be a surprise. From their point of view, the teacher's announcement appears to contain a contradiction. However, if the teacher suddenly gives the exam on Wednesday, the students would actually be surprised. This result directly conflicts with their earlier reasoning that the exam could not happen on any day. The paradox appears because the student's logical argument leads to a conclusion that turns out to be wrong when the event finally happens. This paradox raises interesting questions about how people think about prediction and surprise. It shows how logical reasoning can become complicated when rules involve both certainty and uncertainty at the same time. The paradox of the unexpected examination explores how predictions interact with surprise and how our expectations can sometimes lead to confusing conclusions. At its core, the paradox reveals the limits of reasoning when we try to predict events that are designed to be unpredictable. The students use a careful process of elimination, yet their final conclusion does not match what actually happens. This conflict gives us insight into the complexity of prediction and expectation. When we examine the paradox more deeply, we begin to see the role of knowledge, expectation, and self-reference in shaping the puzzle. These ideas combine to create the confusing situation that defines the paradox. One important concept involved is self-referential reasoning. The paradox forms a loop where the student's knowledge of the teacher's announcement affects the way they reason about the exam. The rule that the exam must be a surprise means that the student's predictions influence whether the rule can be satisfied. This self-referencing situation makes the logical process far more complicated and leads to the paradoxical result. Another important idea connected to the paradox is epistemic uncertainty. This term refers to uncertainty that exists because people do not have complete knowledge. In this case, the students do not know exactly when the exam will occur. Their reasoning is based on limited information, which leads them to eliminate every possible day. Yet, the exam can still occur on a day they believed was impossible. The paradox shows how incomplete knowledge can produce surprising outcomes even when reasoning seems correct. The paradox also connects to the idea of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias occurs when people focus on information that supports their expectations. In the paradox, the students are strongly focused on finding a day that matches the teacher's condition of surprise. While trying to follow this rule, they gradually eliminate every possible day. Their expectations influence their reasoning and contribute to the strange conclusion they reach. Another way to examine the paradox is through decision theory. Decision theory studies how people make choices and predictions about future events. Normally, logical reasoning helps people prepare for the future. However, the paradox of the unexpected examination shows that predictions become difficult when surprise is part of the conditions. Decision theory reminds us that uncertainty and unexpected outcomes must always be considered when making plans. To understand the paradox more clearly, we can also think about dynamic prediction models. These models allow predictions to change as new information appears. Unlike fixed models that rely on strict assumptions, dynamic models recognize that situations can change over time. The paradox demonstrates how fixed reasoning can lead to contradictions when conditions include uncertainty and surprise. By looking at the paradox through these different ideas, we gain a deeper understanding of how knowledge, expectation, and self-reference interact. Together, they create a complicated situation that challenges our natural understanding of prediction and surprise. The paradox reminds us that logical reasoning can sometimes struggle when unexpected events are involved. When we consider the wider meaning of the paradox of the unexpected examination, we begin to see its importance in philosophy, practical decision-making, and education. The paradox offers valuable lessons about how people deal with uncertainty and unexpected outcomes in many areas of life. One philosophical question raised by the paradox concerns the nature of knowledge and prediction. The puzzle challenges the belief that careful reasoning can always predict future events accurately. Even when logic appears correct, surprises can still happen. This reminds us that knowledge about the future is often uncertain and incomplete. The paradox also has practical meaning for decision-making and risk management. In real situations, leaders and planners must deal with uncertain events. The paradox of the unexpected examination shows how difficult it can be to predict outcomes when surprise is involved. It encourages people to remain flexible and prepared for events that cannot be predicted with certainty. In education, the paradox also raises questions about surprise exams and how they affect students. Surprise tests are sometimes used to encourage students to stay prepared. However, the paradox invites teachers to think carefully about how surprise and fairness should be balanced in classroom assessments. It encourages educators to reflect on how evaluation methods influence students' learning experiences. The paradox also helps us think about the psychological side of surprise and expectation. People form expectations about events, and these expectations influence how they react when something happens. The paradox of the unexpected examination shows how our mental expectations can shape the way we experience surprise. This idea helps researchers better understand human behavior and how people deal with uncertainty. Finally, the paradox reminds us that logical reasoning has limits. While logical systems are powerful tools for understanding the world, they are not always perfect when dealing with situations that include uncertainty and surprise. The paradox encourages us to recognize these limits and to explore new ways of thinking about unexpected outcomes. In conclusion, the paradox of the unexpected examination offers an insightful exploration of prediction, surprise, and knowledge. By examining the paradox from philosophical, practical, and educational viewpoints, we gain a deeper understanding of how people interpret unexpected events. The paradox reminds us that reasoning can be complex and that surprises remain an important part of life, even when logic seems to predict otherwise. Hempel's Paradox. Hempel's Paradox, often called the paradox of the ravens, explores how we interpret evidence when testing a hypothesis. The paradox challenges our common-sense ideas about what kind of observations actually support a claim. At its center, it asks us to rethink how evidence works in logical reasoning. The paradox begins with a simple statement: all ravens are black. To test this idea, we could observe ravens and check their color. If we see a raven and it is black, this observation appears to support the claim. This seems logical and matches our normal expectations about how evidence should work. However, the paradox becomes more interesting when we begin thinking about objects that are not ravens. In classical confirmation theory, evidence either supports or weakens a hypothesis. Seeing a black raven clearly supports the claim that all ravens are black. However, Hempel's paradox introduces an unexpected twist. It suggests that not only does seeing a black raven support the claim, but seeing something that is not a raven and not black, such as a green apple, also supports it. This conclusion comes from a logical rule. The statement, all ravens are black, is logically the same as the statement, all non-black things are non-ravens. If we observe a green apple, it is both not black and not a raven. Because this observation fits the second statement, it indirectly supports the original claim about ravens. This result feels very strange. A green apple seems completely unrelated to the color of ravens, yet according to the rules of classical confirmation theory, it still counts as confirming evidence. To understand why this happens, we must look at the logic behind universal statements. When we try to confirm a claim like all ravens are black, any observation that does not contradict the claim can count as supporting evidence. Because a green apple does not break the rule, confirmation theory says it provides a tiny amount of support for the claim. This surprising result challenges our everyday understanding of evidence. It forces us to think more carefully about how observations relate to the ideas we want to test. It also shows that logical reasoning about evidence can sometimes produce results that feel counterintuitive. To understand Hempel's paradox more deeply, we must explore its logical and philosophical consequences. The paradox questions traditional ideas about evidence and raises deeper questions about what it means for evidence to support a hypothesis. One important concept involved is confirmation by observation. According to classical confirmation theory, any observation that does not contradict a claim can be treated as supporting evidence. Because of this rule, observing objects that are not black, such as green apples, technically supports the claim that all ravens are black. The paradox also shows a problem with relevance in confirmation theory. Even though a green apple logically supports the hypothesis, it does not seem relevant to the question of whether ravens are black. This gap between logic and relevance creates the puzzling feeling that something about the reasoning is wrong. We can understand the paradox more clearly by looking at different examples. Observation of a black raven directly supports the statement that all ravens are black. Observation of a black cat does not contradict the statement and is loosely consistent with it, but it is only weakly connected because the animal is not a raven. Observation of a green apple is both not black and not a raven. According to confirmation theory, this also supports the claim, even though it feels unrelated. Observation of a white raven clearly contradicts the claim and therefore disproves the hypothesis immediately. Another idea connected to the paradox is confirmation holism. This idea suggests that hypotheses are not tested alone, but together with other beliefs and background assumptions. Hempel's paradox shows that the connection between evidence and hypotheses may be more complicated than it first appears. The paradox also encourages us to rethink how scientific ideas are tested. In real scientific work, researchers do not treat every logically consistent observation as equally useful. Instead, they focus on evidence that is directly related to the hypothesis being examined. Hempel's paradox, therefore, has wider meaning for scientific reasoning and our understanding of evidence. One important lesson is the importance of contextual relevance when judging evidence. Although formal logic may say that many observations support a hypothesis, scientists usually focus only on observations that are directly connected to the question being studied. The paradox also reveals the limits of strict confirmation theory. While logic suggests that many observations can count as confirming evidence, scientific thinking requires choosing evidence that is meaningful and informative. The scientific method emphasizes testing ideas through experiments and observations that relate directly to the hypothesis. Even though Hempel's paradox shows that many observations can technically support a claim, scientists still need to focus on evidence that builds clear and useful knowledge. The paradox also connects to the idea of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias occurs when people focus on evidence that supports their beliefs and ignore evidence that challenges them. Hempel's paradox reminds us that interpreting evidence requires careful thinking and awareness of these biases. Finally, the paradox influences how scientific theories are developed. When scientists create theories, they must organize evidence in a way that is logically consistent but also meaningful in the real world. Hempel's paradox shows that logical support alone is not enough. Relevance and explanatory power are also essential. In conclusion, Hempel's paradox challenges our everyday understanding of evidence and confirmation. It shows how complicated the relationship between observations and hypotheses can be. By examining this paradox, we gain a deeper understanding of scientific reasoning and the importance of focusing on relevant and meaningful evidence when testing ideas. Paradox of the unexpected hanging. The paradox of the unexpected hanging, also known as the unexpected examination paradox, is a captivating logical puzzle that explores the nature of prediction and surprise. The paradox is framed around a seemingly straightforward scenario involving a judge, a prisoner, and the concept of an unexpected event. The core of the paradox lies in understanding how an event can be both predictable and unexpected, at the same time, challenging our intuitive grasp of logic and foresight. Imagine that a judge informs a condemned prisoner that he will be hanged at noon on one weekday in the following week, but that the execution will be a surprise. The judge adds that the execution cannot be predicted in advance, meaning that the prisoner will not know the day of the hanging until the execution day itself. This stipulation sets up a situation that seems simple at first, but becomes increasingly perplexing when examined closely. The prisoner begins reasoning about the timing of the hanging and tries to deduce when the execution might take place. First, he eliminates Friday from consideration. If the hanging were to occur on Friday, it would not be a surprise. By Thursday evening, if the prisoner has not yet been executed, he would know that the hanging must occur on Friday. This contradicts the judge's condition that the execution must be a surprise. Following this logic, the prisoner eliminates Thursday as well. If the prisoner has not been hanged by Wednesday evening, then Thursday would become the only remaining possible day. In that case, the prisoner would know that the execution must occur on Thursday, again violating the surprise condition. Extending this reasoning backward, the prisoner eliminates Wednesday, Tuesday, and finally Monday. If he survives until the end of Monday, he would be able to predict that the execution must occur on Tuesday, which would again violate the surprise rule. By this process of elimination, the prisoner concludes that the hanging cannot occur on any day of the week. However, this reasoning leads to an apparent contradiction. If the prisoner concludes that the hanging cannot occur, yet the judge carries out the execution on, for example, Wednesday, the event would indeed be a surprise to the prisoner. Despite his logical deduction that it could not happen, the execution still occurs unexpectedly. The paradox therefore arises from the conflict between the prisoner's logical deduction and the actual occurrence of the event. On one hand, the prisoner has reasoned that the hanging cannot occur because of the surprise condition. On the other hand, if the hanging does take place on a day that the prisoner has ruled out, it will genuinely surprise him. This paradox touches on deeper philosophical questions about prediction, knowledge, and logical reasoning. It challenges the concept of what it means to predict an event and how surprise can coexist with logical deduction. The prisoner's reasoning appears flawless, yet it ultimately fails to account for the real outcome. This demonstrates how certain logical frameworks can produce contradictory conclusions when applied to situations involving knowledge, expectations, and self-reference. In essence, the paradox of the unexpected hanging reveals the limitations of logical reasoning when it interacts with concepts such as prediction and surprise. It shows that even careful reasoning can lead to paradoxical results when the conditions of a situation involve expectations about knowledge itself. The paradox of the unexpected hanging invites us to question the nature of surprise and the limits of logical prediction. It underscores the complexity of understanding events that are described as both predictable and unexpected, revealing the intricate interplay between knowledge, expectation, and actual outcomes. To further explore the paradox, we must delve into the nature of logical reasoning and the conditions under which surprises can occur. One key aspect of this paradox is the concept of self-referential statements and how they influence our understanding of prediction. The paradox challenges us to consider how self-referential reasoning can lead to apparent contradictions. The prisoner's reasoning process is a form of self-referential logic. By attempting to predict the hanging day, the prisoner creates a loop of reasoning that ultimately undermines the very condition he is trying to satisfy, the element of surprise. This type of reasoning is central to the paradox because it highlights the tension between deductive logic and the inherent unpredictability of certain outcomes. To better understand the paradox, we can examine it through the lens of epistemic logic, the study of knowledge and belief. In epistemic logic, we often encounter situations in which the knowledge or beliefs of individuals can lead to surprising or counterintuitive outcomes. The paradox of the unexpected hanging exemplifies how the prisoner's knowledge, or lack of knowledge, about the timing of the hanging interacts with the concept of surprise. Consider the situation in which the prisoner is informed of the hanging but lacks any specific information about the exact day. The prisoner's attempt to deduce the day through logical elimination reflects a form of predictive reasoning in which the individual tries to anticipate an outcome based on given conditions. However, this type of reasoning can lead to paradoxical results when the conditions themselves involve elements of uncertainty or surprise. The paradox can also be related to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which address the limitations of formal systems and their ability to prove certain statements. Gödel's theorems suggest that within any sufficiently complex formal system, there are true statements that cannot be proven within that system. Similarly, in the paradox of the unexpected hanging, the prisoner's logical system for predicting the hanging day is incomplete. The system fails to account for the possibility that the hanging could occur on a day previously ruled out, demonstrating a limitation in the prisoner's deductive approach. Another useful concept for understanding the paradox is game theory, which examines strategic interactions and decision-making. In game theory, the prisoner's situation resembles a strategic game with specific rules and constraints. The judge's announcement establishes the rules of the game, while the prisoner attempts to predict the outcome. The eventual surprise hanging illustrates how the interaction between knowledge and prediction can lead to unexpected results. Exploring the paradox through these various perspectives reveals the complexity of understanding surprise and prediction. The interplay between logical reasoning, epistemic knowledge, and game-theoretic strategy highlights the multifaceted nature of the paradox and its implications for how we approach predictions and expectations. Ultimately, the paradox of the unexpected hanging invites us to reflect on the nature of knowledge and prediction. It challenges us to reconsider how we understand events that involve elements of surprise, and to recognize the limitations of logical reasoning when dealing with such situations. By examining the paradox from different perspectives, we gain a deeper appreciation of the intricate relationship between logic, knowledge, and unexpected outcomes. To fully appreciate the implications of the paradox, it is also useful to consider how it affects our broader understanding of surprise and expectation. The paradox not only challenges our intuitions about prediction, but also offers insights into how we process and respond to unexpected events. One important aspect is the concept of psychological surprise. The paradox demonstrates that an event can be genuinely surprising even when it appears logically predictable. Psychological surprise refers to the emotional and cognitive reaction people experience when an event contradicts their expectations or mental models. In the context of the paradox, the prisoner's reaction to the unexpected hanging illustrates how emotional responses can differ from logical predictions. Another relevant concept is that of dynamic prediction models. In real-world situations, prediction models often account for changing information and evolving conditions. The paradox of the unexpected hanging highlights the limitations of static prediction models that rely on fixed assumptions. Dynamic models, which incorporate feedback and adapt to new information, offer a more flexible approach to understanding prediction and surprise. The paradox also encourages reflection on the nature of expectation management in various contexts. From personal decision-making to organizational planning, managing expectations is crucial for navigating uncertainty. The paradox illustrates how expectations can be shaped by both logical reasoning and emotional factors, influencing how individuals respond to unexpected events. We can also explore the paradox through philosophical questions about time and causality. The paradox challenges our assumptions about how time and causality interact with prediction. If an event is described as a surprise, It suggests that it defies our causal expectations. This raises questions about whether our understanding of cause and effect can fully account for situations involving surprise. The practical implications of the paradox extend into fields such as decision theory and risk management. In decision-making processes, individuals and organizations must often prepare for events that cannot be perfectly predicted. The paradox illustrates the importance of acknowledging uncertainty and remaining flexible in the face of unexpected outcomes. Finally, the paradox invites us to reflect on the philosophical nature of reality and perception. By examining how surprise and prediction interact with our understanding of the world, we gain insight into broader philosophical questions about how reality is interpreted and understood. The paradox challenges us to reconcile logical reasoning with the unpredictable nature of real-world events. In conclusion, the paradox of the unexpected hanging provides profound insights into the nature of prediction, surprise, and expectation. By exploring the paradox through psychological, logical, and philosophical perspectives, we gain a deeper understanding of how humans interpret and respond to unexpected events. The paradox reminds us of the intricate relationship between logic, knowledge, and reality, and encourages us to reconsider the limits of our predictive reasoning. Paradox of the perfect murder. To understand the paradox of the perfect murder, we first need to explain what the word perfection means in this situation. In theory, a perfect murder would be a crime where the person responsible commits the act without leaving any evidence, without any witnesses, and without any possibility of being discovered. This idea describes an ideal situation where every part of the crime is planned and carried out flawlessly. In such a scenario, the crime would leave behind no physical evidence at all. There would be no fingerprints, no DNA, and no forensic traces that investigators could use to identify the person responsible. The crime would take place in a way that leaves no material clues that could connect the perpetrator to what happened. The event would also occur without anyone seeing or hearing anything suspicious. This would include avoiding cameras, surveillance systems, and electronic devices that might record the act. In addition, the person responsible would not have any clear motive or opportunity that might cause investigators to suspect them. They would need to make sure that the crime does not match any known patterns and does not involve any obvious connection to the victim. For a crime to reach this level of perfection, it would require extremely careful planning and execution. The person committing the act would have to think about every possible detail and prevent any situation that might reveal their involvement. One of the biggest challenges in such planning is human error. Even the most carefully designed plans can fail because of unexpected events or small mistakes. These possibilities introduce uncertainty and make the idea of a truly perfect crime difficult to achieve. This is where the paradox appears. The idea of a perfect murder assumes complete control over every detail of the situation. However, in the real world, such complete control is almost impossible. Achieving a crime that leaves absolutely no trace is extremely difficult and may even be impossible in practice. From a philosophical perspective, the idea of a perfect murder also raises questions about the nature of perfection itself. Is perfection something that can truly exist in the real world, or is it only an ideal concept that exists in theory? The paradox suggests that perfection might never be fully achievable because the world is unpredictable and constantly changing. The paradox also raises important ethical questions. Even if someone could commit a murder perfectly and never be caught, that would not make the act morally acceptable. The ethical consequences of the crime remain the same, whether or not the person responsible is discovered. The paradox of the perfect murder shows how complicated it is to commit a crime without leaving any evidence or trace behind. Looking at real examples and theoretical ideas can help us understand these difficulties more clearly. Throughout history, There have been many cases where individuals attempted to commit crimes in ways that avoided detection. Some crimes were initially believed to be perfect because investigators could not immediately find evidence or identify the person responsible. These cases often received significant public attention. However, many of these so-called perfect crimes were eventually solved when new evidence appeared or when investigators discovered new leads. Modern forensic science and investigative technology have made it much harder for someone to commit a crime without leaving evidence. Techniques such as DNA analysis, digital investigation, and advanced surveillance systems have greatly increased the chances that crimes can be solved. Even very small clues, such as digital records or microscopic traces of materials, can help investigators uncover the truth. The idea of a perfect murder assumes that every part of the situation can be controlled. In reality, chance always plays a role in human events. Unexpected factors, such as human behavior, environmental changes, or equipment failures, can influence what happens. Because of these unpredictable elements, achieving perfection becomes extremely unlikely. The pursuit of a perfect crime also raises questions about justice and the legal system. Even if a crime were committed without leaving evidence, the moral and legal issues surrounding the act would still exist. Justice involves more than simply catching criminals. It also involves questions about responsibility, fairness, and the effects that actions have on society. The idea of a perfect murder also highlights the importance of strong investigative methods and forensic science. As technology improves, law enforcement agencies continue developing new ways to detect and solve crimes. The justice system constantly evolves in order to deal with new challenges and apply advanced tools in criminal investigations. The paradox also influences legal philosophy and how people think about guilt and responsibility. It raises questions about the relationship between evidence and truth. A person may be guilty even if there is no evidence to prove it, which creates complicated questions about how justice should be carried out. Ultimately, the paradox of the perfect murder works as a thought experiment that helps us think about crime, justice, and human behavior. It shows how difficult it is to achieve absolute perfection and highlights the roles of chance, technology, and ethics within the justice system. The idea of committing a perfect crime often comes from psychological motivations. Some people may feel a desire for control or mastery, or they may want to prove that they can outsmart others. These motivations reflect deeper aspects of human psychology, including fascination with perfection and the desire to overcome limitations. However, the paradox also reminds us of human weakness. Even the most detailed plans can fail because people make mistakes or face unexpected situations. This shows the limits of human control and demonstrates how difficult it is to achieve perfection in any activity. Trying to commit a perfect crime requires hiding evidence, avoiding witnesses, and controlling many different variables at once. Managing all these factors successfully is extremely difficult, which makes the idea of a flawless crime very unlikely. The paradox also reflects how crime and justice continue to change over time. As investigative tools improve and society develops new technologies, the ways crimes are committed and solved also change. Because of these developments, the idea of a perfect crime becomes even harder to achieve. From a philosophical point of view, the paradox invites us to think about the meaning of perfection itself. It encourages us to ask whether perfection can truly exist in reality or whether it remains only an abstract idea. The paradox suggests that imperfection may always be part of human life and human actions. It also raises ethical questions about striving for flawless outcomes in harmful actions. Attempting to achieve perfection in wrongdoing highlights the importance of moral responsibility and ethical reflection. The idea of a perfect murder has also influenced popular culture. Stories about perfect crimes appear frequently in novels, films, and television programs. These stories shape the way people think about crime, intelligence, and the pursuit of perfection. The paradox also influences discussions about law and ethics by encouraging debates about evidence, responsibility, and justice. It reminds us that justice involves more than simply solving crimes. It also includes broader ideas about fairness and social responsibility. In conclusion, the paradox of the perfect murder is a thought-provoking exploration of crime, perfection, and human behavior. It shows how difficult it is to achieve flawless outcomes and provides insight into the nature of justice, ethics, and the limits of human control. By thinking about this paradox, we gain a deeper understanding of the challenges involved in crime investigation and the philosophical questions connected to the idea of perfection in any area of life. Paradox of self-replicating machines. The idea of a self-replicating machine is a fascinating concept that explores automation, technology, and the process of replication itself. In simple terms, a self-replicating machine is a device designed to produce copies of itself without any outside help. This means the machine would gather materials and energy from its surroundings and use them to build another machine that is identical to itself, including all the parts and abilities needed to work properly. To understand this idea more clearly, imagine a machine with highly advanced abilities. First, the machine would need to collect raw materials from the environment around it. These materials could include metals, plastics, or other substances required to build its different parts. After gathering these resources, the machine would begin processing them. This stage would involve turning raw materials into usable components through actions such as cutting, shaping, and assembling different pieces. Once all the required parts are created, the machine would then assemble them into a complete working copy of itself. This step would require careful coordination and extreme precision so that the new machine operates in the same way as the original one. After the new machine is finished, it could begin the same process again, creating more machines. In theory, this could create a chain reaction where machines continue producing more machines. The theoretical roots of self-replicating machines can be traced back to the mathematician John von Neumann, who introduced the idea in the 1940s. Von Neumann described something called a universal constructor. This was a theoretical machine that could build copies of itself using raw materials from its surroundings. The universal constructor was imagined not only as a self-replicating device, but also as a machine capable of building many different types of machines and structures. Von Neumann's ideas formed the foundation for later research into self-replication in science and technology. In real-world applications, the idea of self-replicating machines has attracted attention in fields such as nanotechnology and space exploration. For example, in future space missions, self-replicating machines could be used to build spacecraft or living structures by using materials found on other planets or asteroids. This method could reduce the need to transport large amounts of supplies from Earth and could allow humans to build infrastructure in space more efficiently. Nanotechnology also investigates self-replication on a much smaller scale. Scientists have imagined tiny machines called nanobots that could replicate themselves at a microscopic level. If such machines were ever developed, they might build complex structures, molecule by molecule. This ability could transform industries by allowing extremely precise manufacturing of materials and devices. However, the idea of self-replicating machines also creates several problems and paradoxes. One major concern involves the need for large amounts of resources. A machine that copies itself must collect and process many raw materials. This raises questions about whether enough resources would exist for the machines to continue replicating, especially in environments where materials are limited. The practical challenges involved in self-replication are numerous and complicated. One major difficulty is managing the materials required for replication. A self-replicating machine must gather resources efficiently from its surroundings. This means not only collecting materials, but also converting them into useful components. The efficiency of this process determines whether the machine can successfully reproduce itself. Another serious challenge is the possibility of uncontrolled replication. If a self-replicating machine stopped following its control systems, or if its replication process became unstable, machines might multiply rapidly without limits. This situation is sometimes called the gray goo problem. In such a scenario, machines might consume all available materials in their environment, potentially causing severe environmental damage. This possibility shows why strict safety systems and control mechanisms would be necessary. The replication process itself also creates technical challenges. Each part of the machine must be reproduced accurately so that the new machine functions correctly. Even small errors in replication could cause defects that weaken the system. If mistakes continue during repeated copying, the machines could eventually fail. Because of this, precision and reliability are extremely important in designing self-replicating machines. The effects of self-replicating machines extend beyond engineering problems. They also raise philosophical and ethical questions about replication and automation. If machines could reproduce themselves perfectly, it might change how people think about manufacturing and production. Machines that can create other machines without human help could reshape ideas about labor, creativity, and innovation. The concept also raises questions about the limits of automation and the need for human supervision. As machines gain more independence, including the ability to replicate themselves, the balance between human control and machine autonomy becomes more important. The possibility that machines might operate independently leads to questions about responsibility and accountability in advanced technological systems. The paradox of self-replicating machines also influences how we think about technological progress and its consequences. The ability to build machines that reproduce themselves offers many exciting possibilities, but it also requires careful thought about possible risks. The challenge is to use the benefits of self-replication while reducing dangers and ensuring that technology develops in ways that match social values. The paradox of the self-replicating machine offers many opportunities to think about the larger effects of technological development. When we examine both the potential advantages and the challenges of these machines, several important themes become clear. One major theme involves the relationship between technology and resource management. Self-replicating machines highlight the need for efficient use of resources and sustainable systems. In real-world situations, it would be essential to make sure machines can replicate without exhausting natural materials or damaging the environment. Achieving this balance would require not only advanced technology, but also responsible planning and management. Another important theme involves the impact of self-replication on society and work. Machines capable of reproducing themselves could transform industries and economic systems. In some fields, human labor might become less necessary. This possibility raises questions about employment, economic fairness, and the future role of human creativity in a highly automated world. As machines begin performing more complex tasks, societies may need to adjust their economic structures and educational systems. New training programs and workforce strategies might be necessary to help people adapt to technological change. The philosophical meaning of self-replicating machines also encourages reflection about autonomy and perfection. Trying to create machines that copy themselves perfectly forces us to reconsider what perfection really means. It also raises questions about the limits of both human abilities and machine capabilities. At the same time, the idea of machines capable of replication introduces ethical concerns. Creating machines with the power to reproduce themselves carries responsibility. Engineers and scientists would need to consider the potential risks and make sure such technologies are developed carefully and responsibly. Looking toward the future, self-replicating machines could lead to important breakthroughs in areas such as manufacturing, space exploration, and materials science. However, reaching this potential requires solving the technical, ethical, and philosophical challenges connected to self-replication. As technology continues to grow and evolve, it is important to approach these developments with careful thinking and balance. Ensuring that new technologies support human values and long-term goals will be essential in shaping the future of automation. In conclusion, the paradox of the self-replicating machine provides a powerful way to think about technology, automation, and replication. It challenges our understanding of resources, labor, and perfection while also highlighting the limits of human control. By studying both the possibilities and the difficulties of self-replicating machines, we gain valuable insight into the future of technology and its influence on society. Paradox of the lottery. Picture that you have just bought a ticket for a very large lottery draw. The possibility of winning is extremely small. Imagine it is only 1 over 10 million. Even though the odds are clearly against you, you still feel excited and full of hope. Strangely, when you hold the ticket in your hand, you feel a quiet belief that you could actually become the lucky person who wins. This personal feeling of confidence may appear surprisingly reasonable, even when the chances are unbelievably tiny. Now, let us look at the situation from a wider point of view. In a giant lottery, where every ticket carries an incredibly small chance of success, each person who buys a ticket can still feel hopeful about their own opportunity. This unusual situation is called the paradox of the lottery. The main point of this paradox is the sharp difference between the statistical probability of losing and the personal belief that someone might actually win. The paradox becomes even more interesting when we think about the result for everyone involved. Even though each person holding a ticket may believe they could win, the truth is that only one ticket, or maybe just a few at most, will finally receive the reward. This situation produces a clear, logical conflict. How can we explain the fact that so many people think they might win when the numbers clearly show that most of them will lose? To understand the paradox more clearly, imagine a lottery with 10 million tickets being sold. Every ticket has a chance of 1 over 10 million to win. If every ticket owner believes they will be the lucky winner, that belief seems highly unreasonable because the odds are so small. Still, on a personal level, it makes some sense. Most people do not stop to think about the chances of everyone losing together. Instead, they think only about their own ticket and what might happen to it. This paradox highlights the interesting clash between individual belief and the reality shown by statistics. It shows how people can hold ideas that appear to disagree with each other. A person may believe that their own ticket could win, while also understanding that most other people will probably lose. Let us explore the paradox of the lottery more carefully by looking at the relationship between personal belief and mathematical probability. Every person who joins the lottery may strongly believe they could win because they feel personally connected to the outcome. Even though they know the chance of winning is extremely small, their hope remains deeply personal. This strong belief stands in direct opposition to the harsh truth revealed by statistics. From a purely mathematical point of view, if there are 10 million tickets and only one winner, the chance that any single ticket will win is extremely tiny. Yet, interestingly, this statistical truth often does not change the hopeful attitude of many ticket owners. One helpful way to understand this paradox is through the idea of subjective and objective probability. Subjective probability describes the personal belief or confidence someone has about an outcome. Objective probability, however, refers to the true mathematical likelihood that something will happen. In a lottery, the subjective probability for each participant is strongly shaped by hope and personal interest in the result. Because of this, someone may believe their ticket has a better chance of winning than it truly does. Meanwhile, Objective probability represents the real mathematical odds, which are extremely small. The large difference between personal belief and actual probability forms the center of this paradox. People continue believing in their own chances of success, even when they clearly understand the statistical reality, which creates a puzzling contradiction. The paradox is not only about the small chance of winning, it also explores the deeper idea of rational thinking when people face very unlikely possibilities. It connects with several psychological patterns and mental habits that influence how people make decisions. Humans often show a tendency to think their chances of success are greater than they truly are when dealing with unlikely events. Psychologists call this pattern optimism bias. This mental habit helps explain why people may still believe they could win, even when the numbers strongly suggest otherwise. The paradox of the lottery raises many interesting questions about human thinking, decision-making, and belief. It encourages us to think carefully about how people understand probability and how those beliefs influence their choices. One important lesson from the paradox is that it reveals the limits of perfectly rational decision models. Traditional theories of rational thinking suggest that people make choices based only on objective probabilities. However, the paradox of the lottery clearly shows that emotions, hopes, and personal beliefs can strongly shape decisions, sometimes leading to behavior that appears irrational when judged by statistics alone. This paradox also teaches us something about how people deal with risk and uncertainty in many parts of life beyond lotteries. People often face situations where the chance of success is very small, yet they still strongly believe they will succeed. This pattern can influence behavior in many areas, such as gambling, financial investments, and even choices related to health. In each situation, individuals may act according to their belief in a positive result, even when evidence suggests that success is unlikely. Another interesting feature of the paradox is its importance in discussions about probability theory and decision theory. It shows how difficult it can be to match personal belief with true mathematical probability, challenging traditional models that assume people always think and act in completely rational ways. In the end, the paradox of the lottery reminds us how powerful hope and personal belief can be in shaping human behavior. Even when statistics clearly show the odds, people's feelings and expectations still play a major role in their decisions. By thinking about this paradox, we begin to understand the complex and sometimes surprising connection between probability, belief, and human actions. In conclusion, the paradox of the lottery presents a fascinating study of the tension between personal hope and statistical truth. It challenges our usual ideas about probability, decision-making, and psychology, offering meaningful insight into how people understand and react to uncertainty in their everyday lives.